Sometime in the mid-20th century, a woman named Racinda Nolasque drew her last breath in a small town in California. She was in her 90s, possibly older. She had lived through the transformation of the American West, through 2 world wars, through the displacement and destruction of the indigenous communities of Southern California by a century of colonization. She had watched her language die around her, one speaker at a time, for most of her adult life. And when she died, she took with her the last native knowledge of Chumash, a language that had been spoken on the California coast for thousands of years, a language whose grammar encoded a way of seeing the world that existed nowhere else on Earth, a language that, with her death, was gone. Subscribe now and never miss a documentary. Every week we travel to the things that have been lost, to the civilizations, the knowledge systems, the ways of being human that have disappeared from the world, leaving only fragments and traces and the persistent question of what was there before the silence. The death of Racinda Nolasque's language was not unusual. Every 2 weeks, somewhere on Earth, a language dies. A language, not a dialect, not a regional accent, not a local variant of a major tongue, but a complete linguistic system with its own grammar, its own phonology, its own vocabulary, its own way of organizing time and space and causality and social relationship into the structures of human communication. Each language that dies takes with it a unique perspective on reality, a way of dividing the spectrum of experience into categories, of expressing the relationships between events and objects and people, of encoding the cultural knowledge accumulated by the community that spoke it over centuries or millennia. When a language dies, a world dies. Not metaphorically. Literally. The question of what is lost when a language disappears is not merely sentimental. Linguists who study endangered and extinct languages have documented specific features of specific languages that have no equivalent in any other language. Ways of encoding spatial relationships, temporal sequences, evidentiality, causality, or social hierarchy that are unique to that language and that, when the language is gone, are gone from the record of human cognitive possibility. We do not know what we do not know. The languages that have already died have taken with them the evidence of what was possible, what structures human thought could construct, what realities human language could encode, and the loss is permanent and unmeasurable. The specific geography of language death is not random. Languages are dying fastest in the places where indigenous communities have been most severely disrupted by colonization, forced relocation, and the pressures of dominant national cultures. In the Americas, where approximately 1,000 distinct languages were spoken at the time of European contact and where fewer than 200 remain in active everyday use. In Australia, where approximately 250 indigenous languages were spoken before European settlement and where fewer than 20 are now spoken by children as a first language. In Siberia and the Russian Far East, where the languages of dozens of small indigenous communities are in critical danger, and in the island communities of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, where small populations speaking unique languages are particularly vulnerable to the economic and cultural pressures that lead to language shift. The irony of the modern language death crisis is that it is occurring at precisely the moment when the technology for documenting endangered languages has never been more powerful or more accessible. Digital recording technology, computational tools for linguistic analysis, and the Internet as a medium for distributing language resources have created possibilities for documentation and revitalization that were simply unavailable a generation ago. A linguist working with an endangered language community today can capture audio and video recordings of unprecedented quality, process and analyze them with computational tools of great power, and share the results with the language community and the wider world in ways that were impossible when Racinda Nolasque was alive. The race between the dying of languages and the documentation of them is being lost, but it is being run more effectively than it has ever been run before. The communities whose languages are dying are not passive in the face of the loss. Indigenous language revitalization movements have emerged across the world, often led by younger members of communities who recognize that the loss of the language represents a fundamental threat to cultural identity and who are determined to restore it. These movements face enormous obstacles. The disruption of intergenerational transmission that is the most fundamental precondition of language survival is extremely difficult to reverse once it has been established, but they have achieved remarkable results in some cases. And they have transformed the relationship between linguists and the communities they study from a relationship of extraction to a relationship of collaboration and mutual service. The most dramatic category of lost language is the undeciphered script, the writing system that survives in archaeological material but has never been read, whose symbols are visible but whose meanings are permanently beyond reach. The most famous undeciphered script in the world is Linear A, the writing system used by the Minoan civilization of Bronze Age Crete, which flourished from approximately 2600 to 1100 BCE and produced one of the most sophisticated and culturally distinctive civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean world. Linear A was used by the Minoans for at least 5 centuries, producing hundreds of surviving inscriptions on clay tablets, stone libation tables, and objects of various kinds. It is related to Linear B, the writing system used by the Mycenaean Greeks and deciphered in 1952 by the architect Michael Ventris in one of the most celebrated intellectual achievements of the 20th century. Linear B turned out to be an early form of Greek. Linear A was the writing system that Linear B was derived from, and it almost certainly recorded a completely different language, the Minoan language, which appears to have been unrelated to Greek or to any other known language family. The reason Linear A has not been deciphered is not for lack of trying. The decipherment of Linear B by Ventris was itself a massive collaborative effort involving dozens of scholars across several decades, and the subsequent attempts to extend that knowledge to Linear A have been equally energetic. The problem is structural. While the sign values of many Linear A symbols can be inferred from their relationship to the corresponding Linear B symbols, the language underlying those signs is unknown, and without a bilingual text, a text in both Linear A and a known language, like the Rosetta Stone that enabled the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics, the meanings of the inscribed words cannot be reliably determined. The Minoans left no Rosetta Stone. Their language, whatever it was, died with their civilization, and the writing they left behind preserves its sounds in a form we can almost but never quite read. The specific tantalizing quality of Linear A is produced by the fact that we are so close and yet so far. Because Linear B is derived from Linear A and Ventris's decipherment of Linear B established the sound values of many of its signs, scholars can read many of the Linear A signs phonetically, can produce a pronunciation, more or less, without having any idea what the resulting sounds mean. The Linear A tablets record numbers and what appear to be commodity names in a format similar to the Linear B administrative tablets. They appear to be inventories of goods, lists of workers, records of agricultural production. But while the numbers are clearly numbers, and the structure of the tablets clearly administrative, the words themselves remain opaque. We can hear the sounds but not the meaning. Some scholars have proposed that the Minoan language was related to the pre-Greek language of Cyprus, or to the language of the Lemnian inscriptions from the Aegean island of Lemnos, or to early Anatolian languages. None of these proposals has achieved consensus, and the most rigorous analyses of the available evidence have generally concluded that the Minoan language is a genuine isolate, a language with no known relatives, evolved from a linguistic tradition that left no other surviving documentation. The Minoans were the people who produced the palace frescoes of Knossos, who invented the earliest writing in the Aegean, who created the maritime trading empire that dominated the eastern Mediterranean before the Mycenaean Greeks absorbed and transformed their culture. And we cannot read a word of what they wrote. The emotional dimension of this near miss, of being so close to hearing the voice of a civilization and being unable to reach it, is one of the defining experiences of the study of undeciphered scripts. The Linear A tablets were sealed by fire in the destruction of the Minoan palaces. preserved for 4,000 years in the same earth that held their undeciphered message, and recovered by archaeologists who were tantalizingly close to reading them but could not quite manage it. They sit in museums and archives, patient and silent, waiting for the interpretive breakthrough that may never come. Waiting for the interpretive breakthrough that may never come. The specific frustration of the linear A problem is amplified by the remarkable cultural richness of the Minoan civilization that the script represents. The Minoans produced art of extraordinary quality and originality. The fresco paintings of Akrotiri and Knossos, with their vivid colors, their dynamic figures, their evocation of the natural world, that reveals a culture of aesthetic sensitivity and cultural complexity. The religious symbolism of the Minoans, the bull-leaping scenes, the snake goddesses, the labrys double axe, has influenced subsequent Mediterranean religious iconography in ways that are still being traced. And the administrative complexity of the Minoan palace economy, evident from the hundreds of linear A tablets, suggests a civilization with sophisticated institutional structures. All of this material survives, visible and accessible. The voice that would explain it, the language that would give it meaning, does not. The Rosetta Stone, the stele discovered by Napoleon's soldiers in Egypt in 1799, bearing the same decree in 3 scripts, 2 of them already known, was the key that unlocked the most famous decipherment in the history of scholarship, and the story of how it was used to decode Egyptian hieroglyphics is one of the great intellectual dramas of the 19th century. Egyptian hieroglyphics had been unreadable for approximately 1400 years before the Rosetta Stone was found. The last person known to have understood the ancient Egyptian writing system died in the 4th century CE, and the knowledge died with them, preserved in a few late classical texts that described the system in terms so vague and so metaphorical that they were actively misleading rather than helpful. For 14 centuries, the millions of hieroglyphic inscriptions covering the temples, tombs, and monuments of ancient Egypt were visible and physically present but semantically inaccessible, a vast archive of human knowledge and cultural expression that no living person could read. The decipherment was accomplished primarily by Thomas Young, an English polymath who made crucial early breakthroughs, and Jean-François Champollion, a French scholar who completed the work and is generally credited with the decipherment. The key insight, that hieroglyphics was a mixed system that used both phonetic signs and logographic signs, not a purely symbolic system as many earlier scholars had assumed, was one of those moments in intellectual history when the removal of a wrong assumption immediately opens the path to the correct solution. Once Champollion understood that the hieroglyphic signs in royal cartouches spelled the sounds of the pharaoh's name rather than representing its symbolic meaning, the rest of the decipherment followed with a logic that seems almost inevitable in retrospect, though it had eluded brilliant scholars for more than a century. The emotional weight of the decipherment, the moment when the dead language of the pharaohs was heard again for the first time in 14 centuries, is captured in an anecdote about Champollion himself. When he finally cracked the code in September 1822, he reportedly ran through the streets of Paris to his brother's house, burst in shouting, "I've got it," and then collapsed unconscious, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had done. Whether or not the anecdote is accurate in its details, it captures something true about the experience of restoring a voice that has been silent for more than a millennium. A world had been lost, and it had been found again. The decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics opened not just a language but an entire civilization. The hieroglyphic texts on the walls of the Egyptian temples, tombs, and papyri contained not just administrative records and royal propaganda, the kinds of texts that administrative writing systems typically preserve, but also medical texts, mathematical treatises, literary narratives, religious hymns, love poetry, philosophical reflections, and personal correspondence. The range and the richness of the ancient Egyptian textual tradition, recovered from the silence that had enclosed it since the 4th century CE, gave the modern world access to a civilization that had been known primarily through its material remains and through the distorted and fragmentary accounts of Greek and Roman authors. The decipherment restored a voice of extraordinary variety and depth, and it transformed Egyptology from a discipline of material archaeology into a discipline of historical and literary scholarship as well. The specific texts that the decipherment opened up included some of the most remarkable documents in the history of human writing. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and instructions for navigating the afterlife, placed in the tombs of the wealthy to guide the soul through the dangers of the journey from death to eternity, is one of the most elaborate and most beautiful expressions of religious belief in the ancient world. The medical papyri, including the Edwin Smith papyrus with its rational, empirical approach to the diagnosis and treatment of injuries, reveal a tradition of medical knowledge and practice that was significantly more sophisticated than the later Greek tradition generally credited as the origin of Western medicine. The love poetry of the New Kingdom period, tender, witty, and deeply human in its expression of the universal experience of romantic desire, reminds us that the people who built the pyramids were people in the fullest sense, with the same emotional and intellectual lives as any other human beings in any other any other human beings in any other age. The medical papyri of ancient Egypt also illustrate how decipherment can recover specific technical knowledge that has practical contemporary relevance. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to approximately 1550 BCE and containing approximately 700 medical prescriptions and formulas, describes treatments for conditions ranging from wounds and infections to dental problems and mental illness. Some of the treatments described in the papyrus have been found to have genuine medical efficacy that ancient Egyptian physicians had discovered empirically, including the use of moldy bread to prevent wound infection, an early discovery of the antibiotic properties of mold centuries before Alexander Fleming's famous observation. The recovery of this knowledge, made possible by Champollion's decipherment, reminds us that the lost languages of the ancient world encoded not just cultural and literary knowledge but technical and scientific knowledge that may have genuine contemporary relevance. The Proto-Indo-European language, the hypothetical common ancestor of the vast Indo-European language family that includes Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Persian, the Germanic languages, the Slavic languages, the Celtic languages, and dozens of others spoken by more than 3 billion people today, is the most ambitious reconstruction project in the history of linguistics, and the story of how it was reconstructed is one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of the 19th and 20th centuries. Proto-Indo-European was never written down. It was spoken by a community that left no inscriptions, no literary texts, no administrative records, somewhere in the Eurasian steppe or the Anatolian plateau or the Pontic-Caspian steppe region. The scholars debate the exact location, at some point between approximately 6,000 and 4,000 years ago. There is no direct evidence for what it sounded like or how it was structured. Everything we know about it has been reconstructed by comparing the known Indo-European languages and inferring the earlier forms from which they descended, using the systematic methods of historical and comparative linguistics. The comparative method, the systematic comparison of cognate words and grammatical structures across related languages, using the regular correspondences between sounds to infer earlier ancestral forms, is one of the most powerful tools in the history of scholarship. It was developed in the 19th century by scholars including Sir William Jones, who first noticed in 1786 the structural similarities between Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and Persian and proposed that they had descended from a common ancestor, and by the German philologists of the 19th century, Jacob Grimm, Karl Werner, August Schleicher, who developed the systematic methods for tracing sound changes through time and across language families that made the reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European possible. The reconstructed Proto-Indo-European language is an extraordinary intellectual achievement. Scholars have been able to reconstruct thousands of words, the entire system of verb conjugation and noun declension, and the broad outlines of Proto-Indo-European phonology with a degree of confidence that is remarkable given the total absence of any direct evidence. The reconstructed vocabulary provides a window into the world of the Proto-Indo-European speakers. Words for cattle, sheep, pigs, and other domesticated animals suggest a pastoral economy. Words for wheels and axles suggest the use of wheeled vehicles. Words for gold and silver suggest metalworking. Words for specific kinship relationships, social hierarchies, and religious practices provide glimpses of the social organization and belief system of a people who lived and died without leaving a single written word. The application of the comparative method to reconstruct Proto-Indo-European is one of the most impressive demonstrations of the power of systematic analysis to recover information that seems permanently beyond reach. The linguist who reconstructs a Proto-Indo-European word is not guessing. They are applying a systematic method that has been validated by its successful predictions. The reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European predicted the existence of specific sound correspondences that were not known at the time of the prediction and that were subsequently confirmed when new ancient languages of the Indo-European family were deciphered. The reconstruction of Hittite, an ancient Anatolian Indo-European language discovered in tablets from the Hittite capital Hattusa in the early 20th century, confirms several specific predictions that scholars had made about the earlier state of Proto-Indo-European based on the comparative evidence from other branches of the family. The decipherment of a language that had been unknown confirmed predictions made about a language that had never been written down, a remarkable validation of the comparative method's power. The specific location of the Proto-Indo-European homeland, the community of speakers from which all the Indo-European languages descended, has been debated for over a century, and the debate has been transformed in recent decades by the addition of ancient DNA evidence to the traditional comparative linguistic evidence. The current leading hypothesis, associated with the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas and subsequently supported by the ancient DNA evidence from the Yamnaya culture of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, identifies the Proto-Indo-European homeland as the grassland region north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, from which the culture and language spread westward into Europe and eastward into Asia approximately 5,000 years ago. If this hypothesis is correct, the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European language gives us a voice from the Eurasian steppe of 5,000 years ago, a voice of the ancestors of speakers of languages as different as English, Hindi, Persian, and Greek, as different as English, Hindi, Persian, and Greek. The specific way in which the Proto-Indo-European homeland hypothesis has been tested and refined over the past 2 decades illustrates the power of combining linguistic evidence with evidence from other disciplines. The ancient DNA revolution, the ability to extract and sequence genetic material from archaeological specimens thousands of years old, has provided an independent line of evidence that can be compared with the linguistic evidence for the spread of the Indo-European languages. The finding that the Yamnaya culture of the Pontic-Caspian steppe carries the genetic signature of later Indo-European speaking populations provides powerful corroboration for the steppe hypothesis for the Indo-European homeland. When linguistic evidence and genetic evidence point in the same direction, the confidence in the conclusion is substantially greater than either line of evidence could provide alone. The Elamite language, spoken in the region of what is now southwestern Iran from approximately 2600 BCE to possibly as late as the Achaemenid Persian period around 400 BCE, is one of the most tantalizing examples of a language that was extensively documented, partially understood, and yet remains imperfectly decoded, representing a unique linguistic tradition with no clear relatives in any known language family. Elamite is attested in thousands of cuneiform inscriptions. The Achaemenid Persian kings used Elamite as one of 3 official languages alongside Old Persian and Babylonian Akkadian, and the trilingual inscriptions of the Achaemenid period, particularly the Great Behistun inscription carved on a cliff face in western Iran by order of Darius I in approximately 519 BCE, provided the key to the decipherment of the system. The Behistun inscription is the Persian equivalent of the Rosetta Stone, a long text in 3 parallel scripts, one of which, Babylonian, was already understood, providing the basis for deciphering the other 2. The decipherment of the Old Persian and Elamite scripts from the Behistun inscription was a collaborative achievement of the 19th century, carried out by scholars including Henry Rawlinson, who physically climbed the cliff face to make copies of the inscriptions at considerable personal risk. Despite the decipherment, Elamite remains incompletely understood as a language. The grammar is complex and in some respects unlike any other known language. The vocabulary is extensive, but many words appear in only a few contexts, making their precise meaning uncertain. And the language's relationship to other languages is genuinely mysterious. Despite the best efforts of linguists over many decades, no convincing genetic relationship between Elamite and any other known language family has been established. Elamite appears to be a language isolate, a language with no demonstrable relatives, evolved from a linguistic tradition that either has left no other surviving documentation or that died out before any other examples were recorded. The people who spoke Elamite thought in a way that was, in its deepest linguistic structures, unlike any thought that can be traced through any surviving language today. The relationship between Elamite and the Dravidian languages of southern India has been proposed by several scholars based on specific grammatical and lexical correspondences that, if genuine, would suggest a connection between the two language families that might reflect a very ancient linguistic spread across South Asia before the arrival of the Indo-Aryan languages. The hypothesis is not widely accepted, partly because the proposed correspondences are not systematic enough to establish a convincing genetic relationship, and partly because the geographical and chronological gap between the Elamite-speaking region of southwestern Iran and the Dravidian-speaking region of southern India is large enough to require considerable elaboration to bridge. But the hypothesis is not entirely implausible, and the alternative, that Elamite is truly a complete isolate with no surviving relatives anywhere, is itself an extraordinary claim that requires the extinction of an entire linguistic tradition without leaving any detectable trace in any other surviving language. The administrative texts of the Elamite period reveal a sophisticated civilization that maintained detailed records of agricultural production, labor allocation, and commercial transactions in ways that parallel the palace economies of Mesopotamia and the Mycenaean world. The Elamite city of Susa, one of the great cities of the ancient Near East, continuously occupied from approximately 4200 BCE to the Mongol conquest in the 13th century CE, one of the longest continuously inhabited cities in human history, was the administrative center from which the Elamite kingdom governed its territory, and the archives of cuneiform tablets recovered from Susa have provided much of what we know about the Elamite language and civilization. The tablets record a civilization of considerable organizational sophistication, but the language in which that sophistication was expressed remains, in its deeper structures, beyond our full understanding. Remains, in its deeper structures, beyond our full understanding. The broader category of language isolates, languages with no demonstrable relatives in any known language family, is a remarkable feature of the world's linguistic landscape. In addition to Elamite, the major language isolates include Basque, spoken in the Pyrenees region of Spain and France, which is the only surviving pre-Indo-European language of Western Europe and whose origin remains a genuine mystery. Korean, which may be a language isolate or may be distantly related to Japanese and the Tungusic and Mongolic language families in a broader grouping sometimes called Altaic, and Burushaski, spoken in the Hunza Valley of northern Pakistan, whose structural complexity and lexical uniqueness have defied all attempts at family classification. Each of these languages represents a linguistic tradition that evolved independently of all the other known language families, and each one that disappears eliminates an irreplaceable data point in the understanding of what human language can be. The Voynich manuscript, a mysterious illustrated document discovered in the early 20th century and radiocarbon dated to the early 15th century, is the most famous and most intractable of the potentially lost language mysteries, a text that may encode a genuine language, a constructed language, a cipher, or nothing at all. The manuscript consists of approximately 240 pages of dense text written in an unknown script, accompanied by elaborate illustrations of unidentifiable plants, astronomical diagrams, bathing women, and other enigmatic imagery. It was purchased in 1912 by the antiquarian Wilfrid Voynich in a library sale in Italy, and its contents have attracted the efforts of some of the most talented cryptanalysts and linguists in the world, including teams of military codebreakers during both World War I and World War II, without yielding any convincing decipherment. The statistical properties of the Voynich text are consistent with those of natural human language. It shows word-length distributions, letter frequency patterns, and repetition structures that are characteristic of real language rather than random text, which has led most serious scholars to conclude that the text does encode some kind of meaningful content rather than being pure nonsense. But the specific language, if it is a language, has not been identified, and the cipher, if it is a cipher, has not been broken. The manuscript may encode a lost natural language, a constructed artificial language of the kind that medieval scholars sometimes invented for philosophical or esoteric purposes, a cipher applied to a known language, or some combination of these. The emotional resonance of the Voynich manuscript goes beyond its specific mystery. It represents the possibility that there is a voice we cannot hear, a mind we cannot read, hidden in plain sight in a document that has been in human hands for centuries. It is a reminder that language is not just a tool for communication but a medium in which entire worlds of thought can be encoded, and that when the key to that medium is lost, the world encoded within it becomes permanently inaccessible, however close we come to its surface. The history of attempts to decipher the Voynich manuscript is itself a fascinating document of the history of cryptanalysis and linguistics. The manuscript attracted the attention of William Friedman, the American cryptanalyst who broke the Japanese purple cipher during World War II and who is considered one of the greatest cryptanalysts of the 20th century. Friedman worked on the Voynich manuscript for years and concluded that it might be an early constructed language rather than a natural language cipher, a hypothesis that would explain its statistical properties while accounting for its resistance to conventional cryptanalytic methods. The manuscript has also been subjected to computational linguistic analysis using modern algorithms, with results that are consistent with natural language structure but inconclusive about the specific language or encoding method. Recent scholarship has added some important context to the Voynich mystery. The radiocarbon dating of the manuscript's vellum to approximately 1404 to 1438 CE establishes a plausible window for its creation, a period of intense interest in constructed languages, philosophical alphabets, and esoteric communication systems among European scholars. The illustrations of plants, while unidentifiable with certainty, share stylistic features with the botanical illustration tradition of the same period, suggesting an author embedded in the European scholarly culture of the early 15th century. None of this identifies the language or the encoding method, but it narrows the range of plausible hypotheses and makes the manuscript slightly less mysterious, though no less unreadable. The application of artificial intelligence to undeciphered scripts represents the most recent frontier in the effort to read languages that have resisted all previous attempts. Machine learning algorithms trained on known ancient scripts have been applied to Linear A, the Indus Valley script, and the Voynich manuscript, with results that are intriguing but not conclusive. The AI systems can identify patterns in the sign sequences, group signs by contextual usage, and generate hypotheses about sign values that can then be tested against the known content of related texts. But the fundamental problem remains. Without a bilingual text, the AI cannot verify its hypotheses against independent evidence, and the patterns it identifies may reflect the structure of the script or the underlying language without revealing the specific meaning of specific signs. The technology has expanded the range of hypotheses that can be generated and tested, but it has not yet broken any of the major undeciphered scripts. IT has not yet broken any of the major undeciphered scripts. The specific script family known as Cretan hieroglyphics, an even earlier and less well understood Minoan writing system that preceded Linear A and appears to have been in use from approximately 2100 to 1700 BCE, adds another layer to the Aegean undeciphered script problem. Cretan hieroglyphics consists of approximately 70 signs, some of which are clearly pictographic in origin, and appears on seals, pottery, and a small number of tablets. Its relationship to Linear A is disputed. Some scholars view it as an ancestor of Linear A, others as a parallel writing system, and its language, if it records a language at all, is entirely unknown. The problem of the undeciphered scripts of the ancient Aegean is therefore not just one problem but a nested set of problems, each adding to the sense that a significant portion of the cultural and intellectual life of one of the most important ancient civilizations is permanently beyond our reach. The indigenous languages of the Americas represent the greatest diversity of linguistic structure and the greatest rate of language death in the world, and the story of their destruction and partial survival is one of the most significant chapters in the history of human linguistic knowledge. Before European contact, the Americas were home to several hundred distinct language families, an extraordinary diversity that took linguists many decades to fully appreciate and that is still not completely mapped. The language families of the Americas include isolates with no known relatives, families of dozens of related languages, and languages with grammatical structures so unlike anything in the European linguistic tradition that the first linguists to study them struggled to describe them accurately using the conceptual tools developed for Indo-European languages. The diversity of grammatical structures in the languages of the Americas reveals the full range of what human language can be, structures that are simply absent from European languages and that expand the understanding of what is possible in human communication. Many North American languages are polysynthetic. They construct complex sentences by incorporating what would in European languages be multiple words and phrases into a single complex word, expressing in a single grammatical unit what English would require an entire sentence to convey. The word structure of Mohawk, for example, allows the expression of who is doing what to whom, under what circumstances, and with what degree of certainty, in a single complex verb form that has no equivalent structure in any European language. The Hopi language of Arizona was famously claimed by the linguist Benjamin Lee Worf to have a fundamentally different conception of time than European languages, to encode a view of reality in which the categories of past, present, and future that organize European language and thought simply did not apply. Worf's specific claims about Hopi have been challenged by subsequent researchers who argued that he misrepresented the language, but the broader point he was reaching for, that different languages may carve up reality differently, creating different cognitive maps of the same physical world, is a genuine and important question in the study of language and thought. The documentation and partial revitalization of indigenous North American languages has been one of the major success stories of applied linguistics in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The Endangered Language Fund, the Endangered Language Alliance, and dozens of similar organizations have supported fieldwork with endangered language communities across North America and around the world, producing archives of recordings, grammars, and dictionaries that preserve the structural knowledge of languages that may have ceased to be spoken as first languages. The specific knowledge encoded in these languages, medicinal plant knowledge, ecological knowledge of specific environments, traditional navigation and weather knowledge, oral literary traditions of great complexity and beauty, is partially preserved in these archives, available to future researchers and future community members who may attempt to reclaim their linguistic heritage. The Cherokee language represents one of the more remarkable cases in the history of indigenous North American languages. In the early 19th century, a Cherokee man named Sequoyah, who was illiterate in English and had never been to school, invented a complete syllabary for the Cherokee language, a system of 86 symbols that each represented a syllable, which could be learned in a few days and which enabled widespread literacy among Cherokee speakers within a few years of its introduction. The Cherokee Phoenix, a bilingual newspaper in Cherokee and English, was founded in 1828, and the Cherokee became one of the most literate communities in North America within a generation of Sequoyah's invention. The story of Sequoyah's syllabary is one of the most compelling demonstrations of the creativity that indigenous communities have brought to the preservation and expression of their languages. The Na-Dene language family of North America, which includes Navajo, Apache, and the many Athabascan languages of Alaska, Canada, and the American Southwest, represents one of the most structurally distinctive language groups on Earth. The Navajo language, with its extraordinarily complex verb morphology that encodes information about the nature of the action, the shape of the object, the degree of control exercised by the agent, and dozens of other semantic distinctions that English expresses through separate words or does not express at all, was famously used as an unbreakable code by the Navajo code talkers in World War II, its structural complexity making it effectively undecodable by any Japanese cryptanalysts who intercepted the communications. The complexity that made Navajo useful as a wartime code is also what makes it a rich linguistic system that encodes specific ways of attending to and categorizing the world that are unique to the Na-Dene tradition. The study of language death and language endangerment has become one of the most urgent fields in linguistics, driven by the recognition that the rate of language extinction has been accelerating dramatically and that the window for documenting the world's threatened languages is closing faster than the resources available to document them can be deployed. The global picture is alarming. Of the approximately 7,000 languages spoken in the world today, roughly half are considered endangered, spoken by small numbers of elderly speakers, not being transmitted to the next generation, and likely to disappear within the century. The most extreme cases are the languages spoken by a handful of elderly speakers, languages for which the entire surviving knowledge of the linguistic system exists in the minds of 2 or 3 or 5 people, all of them aged, none of them likely to have grandchildren who speak the language. When those people die, the language dies with them, and whatever they knew that was encoded in the specific structures of that language, the vocabulary of an ecological knowledge system, the grammatical categories of a social hierarchy, the specific features of a storytelling tradition, is gone. The language documentation projects that have emerged in response to this crisis are among the most methodologically sophisticated and emotionally demanding in modern scholarship. Linguistic fieldworkers travel to remote communities to work with the last speakers of endangered languages, recording their speech, eliciting vocabulary and grammatical structures, collecting traditional oral literature, and attempting to create as complete an archive of the language as possible before the last speakers die. The work requires technical skills in phonetics, morphology, syntax, and fieldwork methodology, combined with cultural sensitivity, personal diplomacy, and the emotional resilience needed to work closely with communities that are experiencing the loss of their linguistic heritage in real time. The documentation of the Ubykh language, spoken by a community of Caucasian immigrants in Turkey until the death of the last speaker in 1992, is one of the more celebrated examples of language documentation done in time. Ubykh had an extraordinary phonological system. It had 84 consonants, the most of any known language, including a range of sounds found in no other language, and the detailed phonetic recordings made before the last speaker died preserved information about this unique phonological system that would otherwise have been lost entirely. The Ubykh community was originally from the Caucasus region of what is now Russia, from which they were expelled following the Russian conquest of the Caucasus in the 1860s. The community emigrated to Ottoman Turkey, where they maintained their language and culture for several generations before the language began to die as younger generations shifted to Turkish. The last fully fluent speaker was Tevfik Senk, who died in 1992 and who had worked with the French linguist Georges Dumazil for decades to produce a comprehensive documentation of the language. Tevfik Senk was aware that he was the last speaker and that the language would die with him. His cooperation with Dumazil was a deliberate act of cultural preservation, an attempt to leave behind as complete a record as possible of the language that was part of his identity and that would not survive his death. The phonological richness of Ubykh, its 84 consonants, compared with the 6 to 12 consonants of most European languages, was not a quirk or an accident. It was an expression of the specific phonological possibilities of the Northwest Caucasian language family, which had developed over millennia in the linguistically diverse environment of the Caucasus Mountains. The consonant distinctions that Ubykh made, distinctions between sounds that no European speaker could reliably produce without extensive training, sounds that existed nowhere else in the world's linguistic inventory, were as natural and as necessary to a Ubykh speaker as the distinction between P and B is to a speaker of English. The loss of Ubik was the permanent disappearance of 84 consonants worth of human phonological possibility. The broader field of language documentation has been transformed by the development of digital technology and the establishment of language archives. The ELDP, Endangered Languages Documentation Program, based at SOAS University of London, has funded hundreds of fieldwork projects since its establishment in 2000, producing archives of audio and video recordings, transcribed and translated texts, grammatical descriptions, and dictionaries that collectively represent the most comprehensive effort at preserving the world's linguistic diversity that has ever been undertaken. The Archive of the Indigenous Languages of Latin America at the University of Texas, the AILLA, Archive of the Indigenous Languages of Latin America, holds tens of thousands of hours of audio and video recordings in hundreds of languages. These archives are permanent, digital, and increasingly accessible, a very different kind of preservation from the preservation that was possible in the era of analog recording, when recordings degraded over time and archives were accessible only to specialists who could travel to the physical location. The relationship between language and thought, the question of whether the language you speak shapes the way you perceive and think about the world, is one of the most fascinating and most contested questions in cognitive science, and the answer to it determines how much we lose when a language disappears. The strong version of the hypothesis, associated with the linguist Benjamin Leaworth and his teacher Edward Sapir, holds that language determines thought, that the specific categories and structures of the language you speak literally constrain what you are able to think. On this view, if your language has no word for a specific color, you literally cannot perceive that color as a distinct entity. If your language organizes temporal relationships differently from English, you literally experience time differently. The specific grammatical structures of your language shape the categories in which you perceive reality, and reality itself is perceived differently by speakers of different languages. The strong Whorfian hypothesis has been largely discredited in its strongest forms. Experiments have shown that people can perceive color distinctions that their language has no specific word for, and that people can understand temporal relationships that their language does not specifically grammaticalize. The basic cognitive capacities for perceiving the world appear to be largely universal across human languages, not determined by the specific structures of the language spoken. But the weaker version of the hypothesis, that language influences thought in specific ways, making some thoughts easier and some thoughts harder, directing attention towards certain features of experience and away from others, has received considerable empirical support. Speakers of languages that use absolute rather than relative spatial reference, that always describe spatial relationships in terms of compass directions rather than relative to the speaker's body, saying the cup is to the north of the bowl rather than the cup is to the left of the bowl, have been shown to have superior abilities in non-linguistic spatial orientation tasks compared with speakers of languages that use relative reference. The specific spatial vocabulary of a language affects the spatial cognition of its speakers in ways that are detectable in non-linguistic tasks. Language influences thought. And when a language dies, the specific influence it had on the thinking of its speakers dies with it. The specific influence it had on the thinking of its speakers dies with it. The empirical research on linguistic relativity, the effects of language structure on non-linguistic cognition, has produced a growing body of evidence that specific features of specific languages influence specific cognitive tasks in measurable ways. The Gugu Yimithirr people of northeastern Australia use absolute cardinal direction terms for spatial reference rather than the relative terms used by English speakers, and research has shown that Gugu Yimithirr speakers maintain superior dead reckoning abilities and spatial orientation skills compared with English speakers who have grown up using relative spatial reference. The Piraha people of the Amazon, whose language has been famously analyzed by the linguist Daniel Everett as lacking recursion and having no number words beyond 1, 2, and many, have been shown to have a different cognitive profile with respect to quantity discrimination than speakers of languages with full numeral systems. Each of these findings suggests that the specific structural features of a language create specific cognitive tendencies in its speakers, tendencies that are partly a consequence of the language's categories and partly a consequence of the practices those categories encourage. The death of a language, therefore, carries with it the potential death of specific cognitive tendencies that the language made characteristic of its speakers. Whether this represents an impoverishment of human cognitive possibility, whether the range of cognitive styles available to future human beings is narrowed by the extinction of languages that cultivated specific cognitive emphases, is a genuine question. The empirical evidence on linguistic relativity suggests that the answer is at least partially yes. Specific languages do create specific cognitive tendencies, and when those languages disappear, those tendencies disappear with them. The cognitive consequences of language loss are also visible in the changes that occur when a community undergoes language shift, when it stops speaking its traditional language and begins speaking a dominant language as its primary everyday medium. Communities that have undergone language shift frequently describe a loss not just of specific knowledge encoded in the language, but of specific ways of relating to specific environments and specific practices that the language structured. Aboriginal Australian communities that have shifted from their traditional languages to English describe a changed relationship with the land, a sense that the landscape, which was named and categorized and made meaningful in the traditional language, has become less articulate, less personally addressed to the community, more generic and less specific. The language encoded a relationship with the landscape, and the loss of the language is the loss of that relationship in its most nuanced and specific form. The reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European has been complemented in recent decades by the reconstruction of other proto-languages, the ancestral languages of other major language families, and the picture of human linguistic prehistory that is emerging from these reconstructions is transforming the understanding of human population history and cultural evolution. Proto-Afroasiatic, the ancestral language of the Afroasiatic family, which includes Arabic, Hebrew, Berber, Amharic, Somali, and the ancient Egyptian language, has been partially reconstructed from the comparison of the attested languages of the family, providing glimpses into the world of its speakers approximately 10 to 15,000 years ago. The reconstructed vocabulary includes words for domesticated crops and animals that suggest a settled agricultural community, consistent with the hypothesis that the Proto-Afroasiatic homeland was in the Levant or the Horn of Africa in the early Neolithic period. Proto-Sino-Tibetan, the ancestral language of the language family that includes Chinese, Tibetan, Burmese, and hundreds of other languages of Eastern and Southeastern Asia, has been reconstructed from the comparison of the attested languages, revealing a linguistic ancestor that was spoken approximately 7,000 years ago in the Yellow River Valley or the Tibetan Plateau. The reconstruction of Proto-Sino-Tibetan has been significantly more difficult than the reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European because the Sino-Tibetan languages have changed more rapidly and more diversely over the intervening millennia, and because the long history of Chinese literacy has introduced complex layers of borrowing and influence that complicate the comparative analysis. The Proto-Austronesian language, the ancestor of the vast Austronesian language family that stretches from Madagascar to Hawaii, from Taiwan to New Zealand, the most geographically widespread language family in the world, has been reconstructed with considerable detail, including a rich maritime vocabulary that is consistent with the archaeological evidence for the spread of the Austronesian expansion across the Indo-Pacific over the past 4,000 years. The reconstructed Proto-Austronesian vocabulary includes words for specific types of canoes, navigational techniques, fishing methods, and maritime weather phenomena that match the archaeological and ethnographic evidence for the Austronesian seafaring tradition. Words that give a linguistic voice to the ancestors of the Polynesian navigators whose story we have already told. The ancestors of the Polynesian navigators whose story we have already told. The reconstruction of proto-languages also provides evidence for the dating and the geographical spread of ancient language families in ways that complement and sometimes contradict the evidence from archaeology and genetics. The linguistic evidence for the timing of the Proto-Indo-European spread, derived from the internal evidence of the reconstructed language, from the dating of the earliest attested Indo-European languages, and from the identification of borrowings between Proto-Indo-European and other proto-languages, places the initial spread of Indo-European languages at approximately 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, consistent with the hypothesis that links the spread to the Yamnaya culture of the Pontic, Caspian steppe. The reconstruction of proto-languages from the surviving daughters of a language family is sometimes compared to the forensic reconstruction of a person's appearance from their skeleton. The methods allow a partial and probabilistic reconstruction, not a complete and certain recovery, and the result is an approximation rather than a recording. The reconstructed Proto-Indo-European language is the best available approximation of the language that was actually spoken, validated by its successful predictions and its consistency across multiple lines of evidence, but it is not a perfect rendering of the original. The specific sounds, the precise intonation patterns, the regional and social variation that any living language possesses, none of these can be fully recovered from the comparative evidence. What we have is the outline of a ghost, recognizable, evocative, and irreducibly partial. Recognizable, evocative, and irreducibly partial. The reconstruction of dead languages also has practical implications that extend beyond the academic study of linguistics. The legal status of indigenous land rights in some jurisdictions depends partly on the demonstration of cultural continuity, on the ability to show that the current community is the descendant of the historical community whose rights are being claimed. Language is one of the most powerful markers of cultural continuity, and the reconstruction of historical indigenous languages, or the documentation of linguistic continuity between historical and contemporary communities, can be relevant evidence in land rights cases. The linguists who work on reconstructing or documenting indigenous languages are therefore sometimes contributing to legal processes that have direct material consequences for the communities whose languages they study, a reminder that the study of language is rarely as politically neutral as it might appear. The study of language is rarely as politically neutral as it might appear. The Etruscan language, spoken in central Italy from approximately the 8th century BCE until its final disappearance sometime in the 1st or 2nd century CE, is one of the best attested of the ancient language isolates, and the story of its partial decipherment and its remaining mysteries illustrates both the power and the limits of the comparative method in the absence of closely related languages. Etruscan is documented in approximately 10,000 surviving inscriptions, making it one of the most extensively attested ancient languages. The inscriptions include funerary epitaphs, votive dedications, bronze liver models used in divination, and the Liber Linteus, a text preserved as linen wrappings on an Egyptian mummy, the only surviving Etruscan book of any length. Etruscan was written in an alphabetic script derived from a Greek alphabet, and the individual letters are understood. The sounds they represent are known. The problem is not the script but the language. Etruscan appears to be a language isolate. It has no demonstrable genetic relationship to any other known language. Despite the best efforts of linguists for over a century, no convincing family relationship between Etruscan and any other language family has been established. This means that the comparative method, the linguist's most powerful tool for understanding dead languages, is of limited use. Without related languages to compare it with, there are no regular sound correspondences to trace, no cognate words whose meanings can be cross-referenced, no grammatical parallels to illuminate obscure forms. Etruscan must be understood, to the extent it can be understood, from internal analysis of the texts themselves and from the few bilingual inscriptions that exist. The understanding of Etruscan that has been achieved through these methods is substantial but uneven. Many grammatical forms are understood. The meanings of a core vocabulary of several hundred words are known. The structure of funerary formulas and dedicatory inscriptions is well established. But large areas of the language remain opaque, and the longer Etruscan texts that go beyond the formulaic language of dedications and epitaphs to something more like narrative or argumentation, are only partially understood. The Etruscans were the dominant civilization of Italy before the Roman conquest. the people who taught the Romans their alphabet and influenced their religious practices, the civilization that produced some of the most accomplished art of the ancient Mediterranean. And what they said to each other, in the privacy of their domestic and intellectual life, is largely beyond our reach. The privacy of their domestic and intellectual life is largely beyond our reach. The Etruscan civilization's relationship with Rome deserves particular attention for understanding the specific loss that the language's death represents. The Etruscans were not conquered foreigners who left no mark on the culture that replaced them. They were the cultural superiors of the early Romans in many respects, and the Roman civilization absorbed enormous amounts of Etruscan cultural material, including the alphabet, elements of religious practice, engineering techniques, and artistic conventions. The specific influence of Etruscan culture on Rome has been studied extensively by archaeologists and historians, but the study is complicated by the language barrier. The Etruscans' own account of their history, their mythology, their philosophy, and their cultural values is largely inaccessible because the texts that contain that account are either lost or unreadable. The Liber Linteus, the linen book whose Etruscan text was preserved as mummy wrappings on an Egyptian mummy, is the longest surviving Etruscan text, approximately 1,300 words, and it appears to be a ritual calendar listing religious ceremonies to be performed on specific days. It is a fascinating document, but it is not the literary tradition of a major civilization. The Etruscans almost certainly had a rich literary tradition. The Roman author Livy refers to Etruscan literature as a source of information about early Italian history, and the Roman practice of haruspicy, the reading of omens from the entrails of sacrificial animals, was derived from Etruscan religious practice and was codified in a body of Etruscan texts that were still being consulted by Roman diviners in the 1st century BCE. None of these texts survive. The Etruscan literary and religious tradition was absorbed into the Roman tradition, translated or paraphrased in ways that obscured the Etruscan origin, and the original Etruscan texts were eventually lost in the general attrition of ancient literature. The contrast between Etruscan and the other ancient languages of Italy, particularly Latin, illustrates how the political and cultural choices of dominant civilizations shape what survives from the ancient world. Latin survived because Rome survived, and Rome survived because it built an empire that lasted long enough to establish Latin as the language of literacy across the Western Mediterranean. The Church that inherited much of the Roman administrative infrastructure chose Latin as its institutional language, and the survival of the Church through the medieval period ensured the continuous use of Latin as a written language and the preservation of the Latin textual tradition. Etruscan had no such institutional support network. When the Etruscan communities were absorbed into the Roman state and their language was replaced by Latin, the institutional infrastructure that maintained Etruscan literacy disappeared, and the Etruscan textual tradition was gradually lost without any institution committed to its preservation. The languages of the Indus Valley Civilization, the script system used by the highly organized urban civilization that flourished in the Indus Valley of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India from approximately 2600 to 1900 BCE, represents perhaps the most tantalizing unsolved decipherment problem in the world. The Indus script is attested in approximately 4,000 inscribed objects, seals, tablets, and pottery sherds, that bear short texts typically consisting of 5 to 10 signs. The signs are pictographic in origin, depicting objects, animals, and geometric forms that are partially recognizable but whose specific meanings are entirely unknown. The language underlying the script is completely unknown. No bilingual texts exist. No known language has been proposed as a convincing candidate for the Indus language, and the script has not yielded to any of the decipherment methods that have been applied to it over the past century of intensive effort. The specific challenges of deciphering the Indus script go beyond the absence of a bilingual text. The inscriptions are very short, 5 to 10 signs each, which means that statistical methods that work well for longer texts, where patterns can be identified and compared, are of limited use. The direction of writing is uncertain in some cases. The nature of the writing system, whether it is alphabetic, syllabic, logographic, or some combination, is disputed. And the underlying language, whatever it is, does not appear to correspond to any language whose grammar or vocabulary provides clues for interpretation. The most widely accepted hypothesis is that the Indus script recorded a language related to the Dravidian language family, the family that includes Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam, spoken today in southern India and Sri Lanka. The hypothesis is supported by the significant Dravidian substrate in Sanskrit loanwords and grammatical forms, which suggests contact between early Indo-Aryan and Dravidian speakers in the region where the Indus civilization was located. But the hypothesis has not been confirmed through the decipherment of the script and alternative proposals, including the hypothesis that the Indus script recorded an early form of Vedic Sanskrit and the radical hypothesis that the script is not writing at all but a purely symbolic system with no linguistic content, continue to attract scholarly attention. The specific challenge of the Indus Valley decipherment is also a challenge of the sociology of scholarship. Because the script has not been deciphered, and because the proposed decipherments that have been published have generally not achieved acceptance, the field has attracted more than its share of claims that do not meet the standards of academic rigor. Amateur decipherments, ideologically motivated claims that the script records Vedic Sanskrit or Dravidian or some other preferred language, and sensationalist proposals of all kinds have cluttered the literature and made it difficult for careful scholarly work to be recognized and evaluated. The serious academic study of the Indus script proceeds cautiously and incrementally, building the database of sign frequencies and contexts, developing computational tools for analyzing the statistical properties of the texts, and attempting to narrow the range of plausible hypotheses through the accumulation of well-established analytical findings. The question of whether the Indus script is writing in the strict sense, whether it encodes a spoken language in a form that could be read aloud by a literate speaker, has been raised by several scholars who argue that the brevity of the inscriptions and the range of contexts in which they appear is more consistent with a symbolic notation system than with a true writing system. The argument is that the typical inscription of 5 to 10 signs, appearing on a seal that would be used to mark ownership or identity, is too short to convey complex linguistic content and might instead be encoding information like personal names, clan identifiers, or commodity classifications in a form that does not require a spoken language to decode. If the Indus script is not writing but a symbol system, the question of decipherment becomes moot, and the specific language of the Indus Valley civilization may be permanently beyond reach, not because we cannot read the script, but because the civilization chose not to encode its language in writing. The comparison between the Indus Valley civilization script problem and the successful decipherments of the past is instructive for understanding what conditions make decipherment possible. The decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics required a bilingual text, a known related language, and about 23 years of intense scholarly work. The decipherment of Linear B required a bilingual text, the known cognate of Linear A, and about 40 years. The decipherment of the Mayan script required bilingual materials, extensive ethnographic knowledge of Maya culture, and about a century of scholarly effort. The Indus script has none of these. No bilingual text, no known related language, no extensive ethnographic knowledge of the civilization that produced it, and approximately 150 years of failed attempts. The conditions for a successful decipherment do not currently exist, and they may never exist unless a bilingual text or a convincingly related language is found, discoveries that cannot be predicted or manufactured, that can only be hoped for. The death of languages is not only a prehistoric and ancient phenomenon. Some of the most poignant language death stories are from the modern era, when specific combinations of colonial pressure, demographic catastrophe, and cultural disruption produced extinctions that occurred within living memory and were in many cases documented by linguists who arrived in time to record the last traces of what was being lost. The Ayak language of Alaska was spoken as a first language by a single person, Marie Smith Jones, from the death of the second-to-last fluent speaker in 1993 until her own death in 2008. Marie Smith-Jones spent the last decade and a half of her life working with linguists to document her language as completely as possible, giving interviews, recording vocabulary and stories, and participating in the development of a teaching grammar in the hope that the AAC community might eventually reclaim the language through revitalization. The linguist Michael Krauss, who had worked with AAC speakers for decades, described the experience of watching the language die as comparable to watching a library burn, the destruction of a unique record of human intellectual and cultural achievement that could never be replaced. The Yagan language of Tierra del Fuego, one of the indigenous languages of the southernmost inhabited land on Earth, had a single fluent native speaker as of the early 21st century, a woman named Cristina Calderon, who became something of an international celebrity as the last Yagan speaker and who worked with linguists to document the language before her own eventual death. Yagan was notable to linguists for a particular word, mamahlapanatapai, that has become famous on the internet as an example of a concept that is difficult to express in any other language. The wordless but meaningful look shared by two people who both want to initiate something but neither one wants to be the first to suggest it. The word has been celebrated as an example of the specific expressive richness that each language possesses and that is lost when the language disappears. Whether or not it truly has no equivalent in any other language, it has become a symbol of the idea that each language contains concepts and perspectives that cannot be fully translated. Only lost. Contains concepts and perspectives that cannot be fully translated. Only lost. The story of Dolly Pentreth, traditionally cited as the last native speaker of Cornish, illustrates the complexity of the last speaker phenomenon and the way that the boundaries between languages and dialects, between fluent and semi-fluent speakers, and between language death and language memory are rarely as clear as they might seem. Pentreth died in 1777 in the Cornish fishing village of Mousehole, and her death was treated at the time as the extinction of the Cornish language, the Celtic language of Cornwall that had been retreating before English for several centuries. But subsequent research has shown that other people with varying degrees of knowledge of Cornish survived Pentreth, and that the Cornish language, while effectively dead as a first language, had left behind enough residual knowledge in the community for a revitalization effort to eventually reconstruct it from the available evidence. The revitalization of Cornish in the 20th century, producing a standardized written form, a body of literature and music, and a community of perhaps a few hundred reasonably fluent speakers, demonstrates that the death of a language is not necessarily permanent, given sufficient archival documentation and sufficient community will to restore it. But it also demonstrates the limits of revitalization from archival sources. The reconstructed Cornish is an approximation, shaped by the incomplete and uneven documentary record and by the specific choices made by the scholars who developed the standard form, and it may or may not closely resemble the Cornish that Dolly Pentreth spoke in her fishing village 2.5 centuries ago. The language that has been revived is the best available reconstruction of what was lost, not the thing itself. The best available reconstruction of what was lost, not the thing itself. The experience of Marie Smith-Jones, the last AAC speaker, offers a window into the subjective experience of language death that statistics and analyses cannot convey. Jones spoke in interviews of the experience of being the last speaker of her language as a form of profound loneliness, a loneliness that went beyond the ordinary social loneliness of a person who has outlived her contemporaries. She described the loss of the language as the loss of a specific kind of connection to the world, a specific way of being in the landscape, a specific relationship with the salmon and the rivers and the forests of her homeland that the language encoded and that could not be fully expressed in English. She knew she was the last person alive for whom these words and these structures were not merely linguistic data but the medium of lived experience. She was not just a speaker of a dying language. She was the last person for whom a specific world, the world that the AAC language made, was fully real. The world that the AAC language made was fully real. The experience of indigenous communities whose languages have been suppressed combines linguistic loss with the broader loss of cultural dignity that colonial domination imposed. Language suppression was often deliberate. Residential school systems explicitly prohibited indigenous children from speaking their languages. The harm done, the break in intergenerational transmission, the internalization of shame about their own language and culture, is still being experienced, and the language revitalization movements attempting to undo some of this harm are simultaneously linguistic projects and healing processes. The revitalization of near-extinct or recently extinct languages, the effort to restore living, everyday use to languages that have been reduced to a handful of speakers or to the documentary archive, is one of the most politically and emotionally charged areas of contemporary linguistics, and the successes and failures of revitalization efforts illuminate the specific conditions under which a language can be brought back from the brink. The most successful language revitalization in history is the revival of Hebrew, a language that had ceased to be spoken as a first language by any community for approximately 1700 years, and that was revived as the everyday language of the State of Israel in the 20th century. The revival of Hebrew was driven by a specific political and cultural program, the Zionist movement's determination to create a new Jewish national identity around a restored ancient language, and was implemented through a combination of deliberate language planning, educational policy, and the practical necessity of communication between Jewish immigrants who spoke different European languages. The revived Hebrew is not identical to the biblical Hebrew from which it descended. It has incorporated modern vocabulary, simplified some aspects of the grammar, and been influenced by the native languages of its first speakers, but it is recognizably continuous with its ancestor and has succeeded in becoming the first language of millions of people. The revival of Welsh and Catalan, languages that were not extinct but were severely threatened by the dominant languages of the states in which their speakers lived, has been achieved through a combination of political recognition, educational support, and cultural promotion that has stabilized the number of speakers and in some cases reversed the decline. Welsh is now taught in schools throughout Wales, is used in government and broadcasting, and has a community of approximately 600,000 speakers, a significant recovery from the position of extreme vulnerability it occupied in the mid-20th century. The revival of Hawaiian, from near extinction in the 1970s, when the language had fewer than 50 children who spoke it as a first language, to a community of several thousand first language speakers today, was achieved through the creation of Hawaiian language immersion schools, the production of Hawaiian language media and literature, and the broader cultural revitalization movement that the Hakule'i voyages helped catalyze. The Hawaiian revival demonstrates that language revitalization is possible even from a position of extreme weakness, given sufficient political will, community commitment, and cultural investment. Given sufficient political will, community commitment, and cultural investment. The specific mechanisms of language shift, the process by which a community moves from speaking its traditional language to speaking a dominant language, are well understood in their general outlines, though the specific triggers vary from community to community. The key mechanism is intergenerational transmission. As long as parents speak a language to their children and children grow up using it as their primary medium of communication, the language is safe. The crisis comes when parents begin speaking the dominant language to their children, when the practical advantages of the dominant language, the social pressures associated with speaking the stigmatized minority language, or the disruption of the community structures that supported the traditional language combine to produce a generation of children who do not acquire the language as native speakers. The reversal of language shift is therefore primarily a matter of restoring intergenerational transmission, creating conditions in which parents again speak the language to their children and children grow up with the language as a natural part of their daily life. Language immersion schools, in which all instruction is given in the target language from the earliest years of education, have proven the most effective tool for achieving this restoration, by creating an environment in which children can acquire the language naturalistically rather than through formal instruction. The Maori language of New Zealand was revitalized partly through the Kohanga Rio movement. Language nests, complete Maori language immersion environments for preschool children, that spread in the 1980s and that restored the language to a generation of children who grew up with it as an active part of their lives. The model has been adopted by Welsh, Irish, and many other language communities around the world. The specific success or failure of language revitalization efforts also depends on the density of the community infrastructure that supports the language, the availability of media, literature, music, and other cultural products in the language, the prestige accorded to speakers of the language, and the extent to which using the language is associated with valued cultural activities and identities rather than with poverty and marginalization. Languages that are associated with cultural prestige and economic opportunity are easier to revitalize than languages that have been associated with backwardness and disadvantage, and one of the most important tasks of language revitalization movements is the reframing of the language as a source of cultural pride rather than a mark of cultural difference. The philosophical dimensions of language death, the questions it raises about identity, diversity, and the relationship between language and the human capacity for thought, connect the technical and empirical findings of linguistics to the deepest questions about what it means to be human. The diversity of human languages is one of the most remarkable facts about our species. Unlike any other animal, human beings communicate through thousands of mutually incomprehensible systems. Systems so different from each other in their sounds, their grammatical structures, and their lexical categories that learning a second language as an adult requires years of effort and rarely achieves the fluency of a native speaker. This diversity is not an accident or an inconvenience. It is a reflection of the extraordinary flexibility of the human language faculty, the capacity for language that is genetically endowed but that is culturally expressed in an almost unlimited variety of forms. The diversity of human languages is evidence of the creativity of human cultures, of the different solutions that different communities have found to the common problem of encoding human experience in communicable form. The loss of linguistic diversity is therefore not merely the loss of specific communication systems. It is the narrowing of the range of human cognitive and cultural possibility, the reduction of the record of what human thought and human expression can be. A world with fewer languages is a world in which the full spectrum of human cognitive possibility is less well represented, less well understood, and less available as a resource for future human creativity. The linguist K. David Harrison, in his book When Languages Die, draws an analogy between the loss of languages and the loss of biological diversity. Just as the extinction of a species eliminates from the biosphere a unique solution to the problem of survival, a specific combination of morphological, physiological, and behavioral adaptations that evolution took millions of years to develop, the extinction of a language eliminates from the realm of human thought a unique solution to the problem of meaning, making a specific combination of grammatical, lexical, and pragmatic structures that human cultural evolution took centuries or millennia to develop. The specific knowledge losses that accompany language death are also concrete and practically significant, not just philosophically important. Many endangered languages are spoken by communities with deep knowledge of specific ecological environments, knowledge of the behavior of specific plant and animal species, of the patterns of specific weather systems, of the management of specific types of land and water, that is encoded in the specific vocabulary and grammatical structures of the language. When the language dies, this ecological knowledge either dies with it or must be translated into a different language that may lack the specific categories needed to preserve the precision and the depth of the original knowledge. The medical traditions of indigenous communities, the agricultural practices encoded in the vocabulary of traditional farming cultures, the navigational knowledge of maritime peoples, all of these are at risk when the language in which they are encoded disappears. All of these are at risk when the language in which they are encoded disappears. The specific vocabulary of ecological knowledge in endangered languages represents one of the most concrete and most practically significant dimensions of language loss. Ethnobotanists, scientists who study the relationships between human cultures and plants, have documented extensive bodies of plant knowledge in the languages of indigenous communities that has no equivalent in any scientific literature. The specific uses of specific plants for specific medical, nutritional, or practical purposes, the ecological relationships between specific plants and specific animals, the timing of seasonal events that serve as calendrical markers and agricultural guides. All of this knowledge is encoded in the vocabularies and the conversational practices of the communities that hold it. When the language disappears, some of this knowledge can be translated into a dominant language, but the translation is inevitably lossy. The specific categories that the original language used to organize the knowledge may not have equivalents in the target language, and the specific nuances encoded in the vocabulary may be impossible to convey fully. The Australian Aboriginal languages are particularly significant in this regard. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have lived on the continent for at least 65,000 years, accumulating a body of ecological knowledge about the Australian landscape, the behavior of specific species, the management of specific habitats, the use of fire for landscape management, the location of water sources in arid regions, that is unparalleled in depth and specificity. This knowledge is encoded in approximately 250 distinct languages, each adapted to the specific ecology of a specific region, and the loss of these languages is simultaneously the loss of the most detailed ecological knowledge of the Australian landscape ever accumulated. The revival efforts for Australian Aboriginal languages are not just cultural projects. They are conservation projects, working to preserve knowledge that is directly relevant to the management of the most ecologically distinctive continent on Earth. The last speaker of a language knows something that no one else in the world knows. They know what it is like to think in that language, to have the categories of that language available as the automatic, unreflective medium of thought, to perceive the world through the specific lens that language provides. No one who learns the language later, even from the most complete documentation, will know this in quite the same way. The documentation preserves the form of the language, its sounds, its words, its grammatical structures. It does not fully preserve the experience of living inside it. Racinda Noliske, the last Chumash speaker, was not just a repository of linguistic data. She was a person who thought and dreamed in a language that expressed the world in ways that no other language expressed it, who carried within her the last living version of a way of being in the world that had been developed over thousands of years of human life on the California coast. The linguists who worked with her in her final years captured as much of the linguistic structure as they could. They did not capture what she knew that she did not know how to say, the intuitions, the emotional resonances, the cultural associations that were embedded so deeply in the language that they had become invisible even to the person who carried them. Every language that disappears is an irreplaceable loss, not just for the community that spoke it, not just for the scholars who study it, but for the full account of what human beings are and what human thought can be. The 7,000 languages currently spoken in the world represent 7,000 different solutions to the problem of encoding human experience in communicable form. 7,000 different windows onto the same world, each revealing features of the landscape that the others miss. The loss of any one of them narrows the view. The loss of half of them, the fate that awaits the world's languages if current trends continue, is a contraction of human cognitive possibility that we can barely begin to measure, because we do not fully know what will be missing. The voices of the dead, the speakers of Linear A, of Proto-Indo-European, of the language that the Indus seal carvers pressed into their clay tablets, are permanently beyond our hearing. They spoke to each other across decades and centuries, in languages that encoded their specific experience of being alive in the world, and the record they left behind is as close as we will ever get to hearing them. It is very close, in some cases. The cuneiform tablets of the Babylonian scribes, the Linear B inventories of the Mycenaean palace administrators, the hieroglyphic texts on the walls of the Egyptian temples, all of these bring us close enough to feel the presence of minds that have been silent for thousands of years. And they remind us that the languages being lost today, the languages whose last speakers are drawing their last breaths in small towns and remote villages around the world, will one day be the silent archives of minds that are very close to ours and that are losing their voice right now. If this documentary kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are more languages at the edge of silence, More worlds encoded in words that are almost gone. A new documentary every week, always in the hours designed for rest, always going further than you expect, always going further than you expect. The languages being lost today are not relics of a more primitive past. They are the products of the same human capacity for language that produced English and Mandarin and Arabic, expressed in the specific cultural and historical circumstances of the communities that developed them. They encode knowledge, experience, and ways of being in the world that are not available in any other form. They are, in the most literal sense, irreplaceable, because the people who spoke them, and the communities that shaped them, and the experiences that gave them their specific vocabulary and grammar, are all gone or going, and what they produced can never be reproduced from nothing. The last speaker of a language is not a curiosity or a relic. They are the last point of contact with a way of being human that is about to become permanently inaccessible. The linguists who sit with them, recording their words and their stories, are doing something that matters more than it may appear, preserving, in the only form that remains available, the voice of a world that is passing from the earth, the voice of a world that is passing from the earth. The final lesson of the study of lost languages is not about loss alone, but about what persists. The words that survive from dead languages, the scattered inscriptions, the borrowed vocabulary, the cultural memory encoded in place names and personal names and traditional practices, are the proof that languages do not die entirely even when they cease to be spoken. Something of every language that has ever been spoken persists in the languages that followed it, in the cultures that were shaped by it, in the landscape that it named. The full voice is gone. The silence is never complete.